Cleveland Clinic, American Red Cross. You know, these are all major organizations who hold these events at Mar-A-Lago. And so, Tim, how big of a hit is this on the president that now you have, in addition to just Heather Heyer's mother and the Bob Corkers and the Newt Gingriches and the Mitt Romneys, now you have Susan Komen coming out?
Well, the very fact that you have to ask that, or anyone has to ask that question, shows the moral vacuum in the White House. The very fact that we would even be talking about how lucrative the presidency is for the Trump organization is a sign of how we've gone off the rails. I just want to remind everybody, and this is not partisan. Go and look at Ronald Reagan's speech after the Challenger blew. Go and look at President Clinton's speech after Oklahoma. Go and look at what George W. Bush said after 9/11 and the fact that he went to a mosque. Great. The presidency requires you to be better than who you are, because no one is everything of the presidency. No one's perfect. The presidents are their best when they make us heal and they bring us together. Everything the president has done, with the exception of the one statement he didn't apparently want to make, has been pitting one side against another, making politics out of what is a moment of tragedy. Heather Heyer's death is horrific, but can you imagine how many Americans were pained to see those kids with tiki torches, and were pained to see what was yelled at the African Americans who were standing up for equality, for the 14th, 15th Amendments, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act? Can you imagine the psychic pain, let alone the pain that Heather Heyer's family feels? That's what presidents are supposed to respond to and help us get through and help us process. They're not supposed to use it for political gain. And that's what we saw, and that's why we're in pain.
Words and let that resonate with everyone else. Tim, thank you, and Essie and Gianno. Gianno, thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
You got it. Coming up, we have more on our breaking news that Steve Bannon is out. Next, I'll talk to a journalist who interviewed him during the campaign.
The breaking news, we're following Steve Bannon. The president's chief strategist in the White House has now left. He is no longer the chief strategist. I want to bring in Robert Kuttner. He's a co-editor of American Prospect. He was the journalist who interviewed Steve Bannon earlier this week and caused such a huge stir. Bob, thanks so much for joining us. Let me get your immediate reaction to the word that Steve Bannon, the man you spoke to on the phone, is now officially out.
Well, I'm stunned. I think, as your panel indicated, he was pretty much on the ropes before this happened, so maybe this was the last straw. But, you know, the Greeks used to say that character is fate. And he's been displaying a kind of recklessness, a kind of freelancing that put him on very thin ice. And I think it was only a matter of time. And the recklessness fully on display in the conversation with me, not just in terms of what he said about his colleagues, about his boss, about himself, but in terms of just neglecting to even say whether we were on the record or off the record. And this is not a rookie. I mean, it was a rookie error by one of the savviest media operators in the country, in the world.
What was the most reckless thing that you recall Steve Bannon saying about the President of the United States in that interview you had with him?
Well, I think directly contradicting the president's view on Korea, that was pretty reckless. I think going into great detail about the infighting, who he was going to get fired by name. Her job is probably as safe as anybody's job in America right now. And the fact that, you know, he had problems with Gary Cohn. I mean, it was like he was taking on everybody all at once. And I think the other thing that was reckless was his assumption that because he and I happen to have a convergent critique of America-China policy, that I would somehow look the other way, being the editor of a liberal magazine, the American Prospect, that I would somehow look the other way at all of the racism, all of the xenophobia that he's been the architect of, and that he could somehow BS his way into saying, oh, those people are a bunch of clowns. I mean, the things that he said about his own allies were pretty reckless. And I think the assumption that he's going to build a grand left-right coalition for a different trade policy on China, and there have been liberal critics, I think for very good reason. I'm one of them, of the fact that we're letting China to take us to the cleaners with American industry. But the assumption that you could build a grand left-right alliance that would change this policy, I mean, think about it. You can just imagine Steve Bannon going into a meeting of U.S. Trade Rep or Defense Department or National Security Council and saying, all right, here's the game plan. We're going to change our whole China policy. And by the way, I've got Bob Kuttner on my side. And that doesn't exactly enhance his credibility at the Trump White House.
Yeah, and on North Korea, the interview occurred after the president said fire and fury, after the president said the U.S. military was locked and loaded. And in the interview with you, he said, this is Steve Bannon, there's no military solution to North Korea's nuclear threats. Forget it. Until somebody solves the part of the equation that shows me that 10 million people in Seoul don't die in the first 30 minutes from conventional weapons, I don't know what you're talking about. There's no military solution here. They got us. That is in total contradiction to what the president was suggesting in the days leading up to that interview. That must have so startled you to hear that from Steve Bannon.
Well, not only did it startle me, but it was also a lot saner as policy than the president's own view. So one question I have that I think was implicit in the discussion before you brought me in, Trump is famous for having back-channel conversations with anybody and everybody in his circle. So even if Trump is forced out as the official political strategist, is Trump going to continue to have back-channel conversations with him? Because Bannon is the architect of the strategy of getting into bed with the far right. Ever since the initial events in Charlottesville, Trump has been doubling down on that, I would assume with Bannon's encouragement, or if not explicit encouragement, Bannon's fingerprints are on that. What does he do now with Bannon out, with this strategy of becoming more and more reckless himself about stoking up the neo-Nazi right? What's that going to be like without Bannon there to hold his hand and walk him through it? Or Bannon's still going to be there at the end of a phone?
Because there are several people who have been fired or have resigned from this president either during the campaign or since he became president, and the president still maintains, you're absolutely right, that back-channel communication. And so you suspect that the communication with Steve Bannon will continue even though he is out officially from the White House.
I think it makes the White House itself more chaotic, but it also means that Trump is even more reliant on all of these back channels. And I think the man of the hour is General Kelly. I mean, what is he going to do? If he had not succeeded in forcing Trump out, it would have shown that he's impotent. So now we know that he has some power, but does he have enough power given all of the propensities of the president?
You know what? I want to just play for you, Bob, what the president of the United States in that off-the-rails news conference he had Tuesday in the lobby at Trump Tower, he was asked about Steve Bannon's future, and his words were pretty precise. Listen to this.
Look, I like Mr. Bannon. He's a friend of mine. But Mr. Bannon came on very late. You know that. I went through 17 senators, governors, and I won all the primaries. Mr. Bannon came on very much later than that. And I like him. He's a good man. He is not a racist. I can tell you that. He's a good person. He actually gets a very unfair press in that regard. But we'll see what happens with Mr. Bannon. But he's a good person, and I think the press treats him, frankly, very unfairly.
We'll see what happens. And our Jim Acosta, our senior White House correspondent, Bob, is reporting that Bannon was supposed to be fired 2 weeks ago. That, according to a White House official, but the firing was put off. But go ahead and react. I wonder what you thought when you heard the president say, we'll see what happens, Steve Bannon, because that's, to me, that was a sign he's gone.
Yeah, and it's even more vivid in hindsight. That's what you say when you're about to give somebody a gold watch.
Bob Kuttner, thanks so much for joining us. He's the co-editor of the American Prospect. He did that very, very important interview the other day with Steve Bannon. And that interview, by all accounts, Bob, I'm sure, had a role to play in the decision today that Steve Bannon is no longer the senior strategic advisor to the President of the United States. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. Bye-bye.
You know, when the President said, John King, that we'll see what happens, we knew what was going to happen.
We did. I just want to quickly say I read Bob Kuttner for 20 years plus years now, one of the more thoughtful people in the progressive movement, even if you're a conservative, especially on economic policy, that he's in the middle of this, given the liberal American prospect, talking to the alt-right Steve Bannon. The ironies, Washington is a very different place in this environment. But to the point that sound you just played from the President, this is part of the issue and part of the question, and it goes well beyond Steve Bannon. He's asked about Steve Bannon, and he's essentially, the President says, I did this. He came on late in the campaign. It's always about the campaign. He's been President of the United States for 7 months. He has 0 significant legislative achievements. None of his signature campaign promises have made it to the finish line. And you ask him a question about something that's going on in his White House, and it's always back to the campaign. This is the fundamental problem of the Trump presidency. Not who's the chief of staff and who's the chief strategist. That is not to understate the drama of this moment and the significance of somebody as larger, or actually a larger-than-life figure of Steve Bannon being shown the door. But the new chief of staff, maybe he picks a new strategist. Maybe he works with the president on that. It's not about the personnel. It's about the president. Every answer goes back to the campaign. The campaign's over. He's president. Obamacare is still the law of the land. Tax reform is nowhere. He had an event the other day that dissolved into what you just played us there that was supposed to be an infrastructure. That plan doesn't even exist. I do wonder at some point, I know the Trump voters are incredibly personal loyal to this president. At some point, they're good people. They're common sense people. They can do the math. They're going to ask, what happened to I'm going to run it like a business? What happened to Washington is stupid and I know how to fix it? Where is that? To Bob's other point about the outside circle of advisors, I think he raises a key question because the president does still talk Corey Lewandowski from the campaign, to Dave Bossie from the campaign. Now will Steve Bannon get added to that list? I think it's a fair question. You know,
He's presumably, I don't know if he will, but he was one of the leaders of Breitbart, which is reacting. And I want to show our viewers a tweet that just came out by one of the senior editors, one of the top writers at Breitbart, from Joel Pollack. You see that hashtag war. That is a pretty strong statement.
Point, doesn't it? One of the biggest questions I've had as we've kind of wondered when, not if, but when Steve Bannon would be out of this White House, is how the conservative media will respond, and particularly Breitbart, which is a place that's been promotional of this president. What will they do? Will you see them start to turn on Trump? And I think that Joel's tweet there says the answer is undoubtedly yes. Is not going to have a soft landing in these places because Steve Bannon is one of their own. He has been rejected, and they now feel isolated, and they feel like this is a president they boosted, they and their ilk boosted, and now they're being tossed out of the inner circle, and they don't seem to like it.
And this was always the danger of bringing in Bannon, right? I mean, that it would end in this way almost inevitably, but that the outcome there when you do that with someone with the ties that he has to Breitbart and into the broader movement there is that this happens and that they turn on you. The one thing I'll say, and I keep coming back to, and John's made this point, is Donald Trump is the only advisor that matters in the White House. If you've learned anything, if I've learned anything in 7 months of this presidency, it's that John Kelly has said privately, semi-publicly, I'm focusing on the of staff part, that we're going to try and get the staff in order. Departures, Anthony Scaramucci, though, sort of departed himself, and Steve Bannon makes some sense. But the central guy, the guy who's not going to disappear from any pictures in the Oval Office, is Donald Trump. Theoretically, could Mike Pence have some influence on him? Sure, though Mike Pence has been his most ardent, steady defender, even as it related to Charlottesville and his comments there, or lack thereof. So what's difficult is we debate all this stuff. I don't think it is beneficial to Donald Trump to have Breitbart on the outside, to have Bannon on the outside. At the same time, you know, there's a lot of Bannon's views in Donald Trump, whether they were there, whether Bannon cultivated them. Regardless, there's a lot of Steve Bannon in the one guy that we know who matters in the White House.
And you know what was significant was that as we speak right now, the president's at Camp David with a couple dozen of his top advisors, cabinet officials, national security officials. And when the White House earlier today released the list of who was participating to discuss the future of Afghanistan and other critically important issues, Steve Bannon's name was not there.
No, it's a principals meeting in the National Security Council. And you recall, this was a controversy at the very beginning of the administration. He was once on that and then removed from it. Had this meeting taken place at the beginning of this administration, Steve Bannon would have been there. The Breitbart reporter for the White House, Charlie Spearing, his tweet along the lines of what you just showed, and kids, that's the day when Bannon the Barbarian was born. Whether or not that power that Bannon might have on the outside is going to be aimed at Donald Trump, or to John King's point earlier, more aimed at Jared Kushner, Ivanka, Gary Cohn, Dina Powell, the globalists in the mind of Bannon. I don't know that
John Kelly too.
I don't know that it'll be directly aimed at the president, but if you're around the president and considered anathema to the Bannon worldview, I would watch out. Like, you're going to have some heat coming.
John, let's not forget the week that this is all taking place. What happened this week? An amazing, historic week. The reaction of the president to the disaster, to the tragedy that occurred in Charlottesville, Virginia, and culminating with a whole bunch of Republicans strongly condemning the president of the United States, including Mitt Romney, only today issuing a statement whether he intended to or not. What he, the president, communicated caused racists to rejoice, minorities to weep, and the vast heart of America to mourn.
Make a key point, the President of the United States. I think that's been the recurring theme here. You can change personnel, and maybe this is necessary. The President, this will give some moderate Republicans especially who viewed Steve Bannon as toxic from day one, and who maybe don't like to go out and criticize the President, who are getting asked about what he said Tuesday, the moral equivalency of the counter-demonstrators to the KKK and the neo-Nazis. It'll give them to say, well, this is a positive change by the President. But it is the President. It is the President. And with this further fracturing, Breitbart is now at war. Breitbart was on his side for the first 7 months, right? If you further fracture the conservative, Republican, what you want to call it, conversation, does that help you or hurt you when you're trying to get votes for Obamacare? I would argue it hurts if you're in this mess. Does it help or hurt when the conservatives come back next week and say, we're not going to vote to raise the debt ceiling unless we get offsetting spending cuts? A recurring drama we've heard throughout Republican years in Washington, but now you have a Republican president. So administration that has zero significant legislative achievements before you now is in a more messy environment, even on its side, the part that it has been able to keep together. The Trump base has been solid. His other poll numbers are terrible. The Trump base has been relatively solid from day one. Does this impact that? A question mark. But if it does, it further hurts a president who is deeply and profoundly wounded right now.
Just by the way, one quick thing. I mean, there's so much news every week, it's hard to remember all. John is 100% right. Let me just add other attacking Mitch McConnell repeatedly, the Senate Majority Leader last week, tweeting out his support for Kelly Ward, a primary challenger to a sitting incumbent, attacking Lindsey Graham, another sitting incumbent. This is not the way for someone who has no legislative accomplishments, for someone who we really don't know ideologically what the way forward is, and we certainly don't know legislatively what the way forward is. It's easy to say, we're on to tax reform. Well, what and how? Presidents who are much more legislatively versed than Donald Trump have failed at that. Right. You also have the fact that this is someone, I forgot to mention, Lisa Murkowski, Ben Sasse, Susan Collins. There are a lot of senators who Donald Trump has insulted in literally the last 3 weeks, much less since he's been in office, that he's going to theoretically need if he's going to do anything, and they're not going to be for him, even whether Steve Bannon works there or doesn't work.
I'm going to try to do it despite him, not for him.
Yeah. Reince Priebus gone. Anthony Scaramucci, how long did he last? Not very long. Gone.
10 full days.
Sean Spicer, gone. Now Steve Bannon, gone from the White House. The exodus continues. Our special coverage resumes right after a quick break.
We're out of CNN breaking news.
Hello, I'm Wolf Blitzer. Wherever you're watching from around the world, thanks very much for joining us. We begin with breaking news right here in Washington, D.C. President Trump's chief strategist, Steve Bannon, is now out. That, according to two administration officials, the president and the White House, they were debating how and when to dismiss Steve Bannon, but now we have confirmed he will no longer be the chief strategist over at the White House. Steve Bannon, 63 years old, is out. Let's go to our senior White House correspondent, Jim Acosta. He's covering the president up in Bedminster, New Jersey. This is major news, a very significant development, and it comes on the heels of several other senior officials leaving.
That's right, Wolf. And I'm just hearing from one White House official in the last couple of minutes here that it is believed that Steve Bannon resigned, but it is also believed that he may have been given the option to resign. So it sounds like, Wolf, from a source I'm just talking to in the last couple of minutes here, that he was essentially forced out of this position as chief strategist at the White House. And one of the big reasons why, and we've heard this time and again, from people close to the president does not like other people inside the White House stealing the limelight. And you saw this happen time and again. Steve Bannon appearing on the cover of Time magazine, Steve Bannon lampooned on Saturday Night Live. There were times that this just got under the president's skin. And as you know, over the last week, Steve Bannon has been doing some pretty high profile interviews. We were just hearing from sources yesterday that Bannon said he was doing this to divert attention from the president's very disastrous press conference that he had on Tuesday over at Trump Tower. That apparently rankled people inside the White House as well. I also heard from sources earlier in the week, Wolf, that new Chief of Staff John Kelly simply felt that Steve Bannon was not a team player, that he was out there sort of promoting himself, had his own agenda, and was not putting the president's agenda first. That was something that was just not going to work, and the new power structure, is the way it was explained to me by White House sources, under John Kelly. And so it really is no surprise here that Steve Bannon is out. One concern that they do have inside the White House, and we've heard this from several sources over a long period of time, because it's been speculated before that Steve Bannon would be pushed out. There is a concern inside the White House that now that Bannon is on the outside, what is going to be the reaction? As you know, Wolf, Steve Bannon was one of the top executives at Breitbart Online. He was the head of Breitbart Online for some time. That is a very conservative, hard right outlet, and the concern is that that Steve Bannon will direct potshots at this White House from the outside. That is a concern that the president and his team have had for some time, but nevertheless, the feeling was inside the White House, talking to several sources, Wolf, that Steve Bannon just had to go. This was becoming sort of an untenable situation because he was just creating too much controversy for himself. And so the president and his team apparently feeling that it was appropriate for him to go. Again, I'm being told by a White House source in just the last couple of minutes that the belief is that he resigned, that he stepped aside, but there is also a belief inside the White House that he was given that option. So essentially he was pushed out, Wolf.
It's a very, very significant development, and it comes following several other very, very high-level resignations, which raises the question right now, and I wonder if you could answer it, why now, and what's going to be the impact of all these significant staff shakeups?
Well, we know when John Kelly came in that he was implementing some changes that were not going to sit well with some people inside the White House. He was restricting access to the president, not only in person. Remember, before John Kelly came on board, Reince Priebus was the chief of staff, and people from the inside of the White House to the outside of the White House, the president's friends and so on, had these sort of walk-in privileges where they could essentially go in and see the president whenever they felt like it and give him any opinion they felt like giving. My understanding is from talking to top officials at the White House that John Kelly has even been getting on the phone and sitting in on phone calls with people trying to talk to the president on the phone. So John Kelly is certainly trying to clamp down on the advice, the input, the information that this president is receiving as a way to sort of streamline the process over there, and also to try to prevent some of the problems that obviously you see play out with the president, where he puts out tweets that are factually incorrect when he goes out and makes statements like he did the other day at the press conference at Trump Tower, which just ignited a firestorm of controversy. John Kelly is trying to get a handle on all of that. But of course, Wolf, as you know, the chief of staff can only do so much. He still works for the president. He can't control what the president says or does 24 hours a day.
Jim Acosta, stand by. Our White House reporter Caitlin Collins is working the story for us as well. You're getting more inside information, Caitlin. What are you hearing?
Yeah, so obviously we know that Steve Bannon is out. We do not know if he resigned or if he was asked to resign by the president today, Wolf, but we do know that the president was furious this week after Steve Bannon did this interview with a reporter for the American Prospect. As you know, Wolf, in that interview, Steve Bannon contradicted the president on North Korea, saying that there is no military solution for it. And he also asserted that he could make personnel changes at the State Department. He was bad-mouthing his colleagues over at the White House. And we know that the president was furious about that interview. That's been a problem that's come up before with Steve Bannon. The president does not like when Steve Bannon gets credit for his success. Back in April, he told a New York Post columnist that he was his own best strategist. And even this week, we heard from the president he would not guarantee Steve Bannon's job security. This week at Trump Tower, in a press conference with reporters, he said that Steve Bannon was a good person, but he said we'll have to see about Steve Bannon's future. And I guess, Wolf, we're seeing about Steve Bannon's future right now today.
We certainly are. Steve Bannon out as chief strategist at the White House. Let's get some analysis. Joining us, CNN politics reporter and editor-at-large Chris Cillizza, CNN political director David Chalian, CNN politics editor Juana Summers, and our chief national correspondent John King. John, shouldn't have come as a surprise after this interview in the American Prospect when he said this about the president of the United States, referring to the North Korean strategy. He said, in Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, Trump has met his match. The risk of two arrogant fools blundering into a nuclear exchange is more serious than at any time since October 1962. Two arrogant fools.
You shouldn't say that about your boss anyway, especially when your boss is the president of the United States. It's stunning. The entire interview is stunning. But in that, he's not only talking about two arrogant fools, saying his boss, the president of the United States, is a fool. He also essentially said, pay no attention to what you heard from the president last week when the president was saying locked and loaded, fire and fury, using the more muscular rhetoric about North Korea. He says there is no military option. We know there's no military option unless you're prepared for millions of people to die in Seoul. So he went on the record. He insists after the fact he didn't think it was an interview. In criticizing the president. So Steve Bannon has been a controversy inside the Trump White House from day one, and on this day, he is gone. But this is the defining question is, Steve Bannon is not the source of the chaos in the White House. He may be part of the chaos in the White House, but the source of the chaos in the White House is the president. What will the president do? His first chief of staff is gone. Now his chief strategist is gone. They've had a very hard time. I know people who they reached out to for chief of staff who said no. John Kelly now has that job. I know several people they reached out for communications and strategy jobs who said no. Now what happens? It's the president who sends mixed signals and conflicting signals on policy. It's the president who lashes out on Twitter with anger and outbursts at his critics. And it is the president who dug the ditch much deeper this past week with his moral and character failing after Charlottesville. So Steve Bannon can go. That will create theater and drama here in Washington. It could create a backlash among media elements, especially who are part of the Trump base and part of his support. But the biggest question here is, if the president decided it's time to come to do this, what lesson does he learn from it, if any?
David Chalian.
Well, we should do away with the word resignation right now, because I mean, perhaps he offered a piece of paper. That's like saying if he's going to do this to spend more time with his family. Let's do away with that. He's out because the president wanted him out, because the president's chief of staff felt this was part of the process of bringing order to this West Wing and more discipline to this West Wing. John is exactly right, and this is exactly what we discussed when Reince Priebus was fired, who also, by the way, said he resigned. And when he was shown the door, the same thing. Was all of a sudden something going to dramatically change? No, because the man who sits in the Oval Office is the same. Now, getting rid of somebody who is affiliated and associated with white nationalist ideology, who runs a website where folks from the alt-right find comfort and home.
Used to run.
Used to, although he may be going back, we'll see. But yes, used to do that. Is probably a good thing for Donald Trump to do politically this week, though not sufficient. He still has his comments out there from Tuesday that are lingering out there, where he created the moral equivalency between the counter-protesters and the KKK and the neo-Nazis. And so Donald Trump still will have to address that at some point. Just getting rid of Bannon won't be enough, but you will see many Republican, sort of establishment Republicans on the Hill, who will find this, find some comfort in this move, that there is a serious effort to bring a more streamlined discipline operation to the staff around the president, even though nobody in their right mind could actually say that they expect the president's behavior to change.
The new White House Chief of Staff, General John Kelly, he made it clear the other day, he was in an interview over the weekend, he was repeatedly asked about his does he have confidence in Steve Bannon? He refused to say he did. So this clearly, Juana, emerges as, at least it looks to me, as a win for John Kelly.
Absolutely it is. But I think, to both David and John's point, we also have to resist the impulse of coming out of this situation with another senior White House official departing, being fired because the president doesn't want him there, and saying this is some sort of a reset or a pivot. Only time will tell, because as John notes, if the president's behavior doesn't change, if he does not continue to rein in those impulses to go out and say things that are factually untrue, to say things that are divisive, like comparing counter-protesters to neo-Nazis and members of the KKK and bigots, then we're going to be in this exact same place, and I don't care who is in the president's inner circle.
A lot of Democrats, Crystal, they had repeatedly in recent weeks and months, in fact, called on the president to fire Steve Bannon. So they're going to step back and say this is good news.
I doubt it, but you're right. You're right. They have
heard
called. They have
Democratic senators, Democratic members of the House repeatedly said fire Steve Bannon.
And he has been someone. Look, when Steve Bannon was hired in the Trump campaign, this was not someone where you got 10 good things and 0 bad things about him. This was a decision by Donald Trump that this is a guy who Donald Trump believed the baggage Steve Bannon would bring would be slightly outweighed by the advantages he would bring. This is never someone we thought, well, I guess I'll speak for myself, I thought was going to last 4 years in the Trump administration. It's not who Steve Bannon is. That said, Donald Trump has sort of mainlined Bannonism. This week alone is a good example of it. So, yes, Steve Bannon is gone, but look, from Steve Bannon's influence in the way in which Donald Trump thinks, the way in which he presents almost every argument. Steve Bannon's the leading, the mainstream media is corrupt and terrible. The alt-right stuff, the white supremacist stuff, there is a lot of Steve Bannon's thinking left in this White House. And to John's point, it's left in the figure of the one guy who really matters in this White House, who is the President of the United States. So,
although he hasn't acted on a lot of it yet. I think that's the fascinating part. I think definitely the tone, the tenor of the remarks in Charlottesville were, the moral equivalence, the criticism of the alt-left, no doubt that is echoing Steve Bannon. And that's clear. Look, forget Steve Bannon for a second. That's clearly what Donald Trump thinks. If you watched him at that news conference, he came back to it repeatedly. He wanted to have that conversation. That is his thinking, perhaps supported and echoed by Steve Bannon. My big policy question, though, is Reince Priebus was the Republican establishment guy. He's gone. Steve Bannon was the, sort of pitchfork, Tea Party, America first, not interventionist in the world. So if you're watching, the president's having a meeting right now. What about more U.S. troops in Afghanistan? That's what his national security advisors say is necessary. We know the president's instinct is, oh, please, why do I want to extend America's longest war? Why do I want to put my fingerprints on that? Steve Bannon was get out. He's not in the room anymore when those conversations are happening. Steve Bannon wanted the president, you saw it in that remarkable conversation with Bob Kuttner in the American Prospect, to get tougher with China, to slap trade sanctions on China. The president hasn't done that 7 months in. That person is no longer in the room. So what happens going forward from an ideological policy perspective, whether it's we're about to go through the debt ceiling conversation. So there are domestic issues, too, that divide and fracture the Republican Party. We know Steve Bannon's piece of that inside the White House. What we don't know is General Kelly's not a political person. Who does he bring in? Who can they bring in? Who will come in to deal with the political, whether it's the policy strategy and how to try to get Obamacare again, how to get through tax reform, how to come back to these debt ceiling and the spending issues. And then, guess what? 2018 is a midterm election year. The president usually suffers in that year. Who runs the political strategy? We don't know.
Jim Acosta is getting some official word now from the White House. What are you picking up over there, Jim?
A couple of things, Wolf. One is the White House has now issued a statement from Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders. It says White House Chief of Staff John Kelly and Steve Bannon have mutually agreed today would be Steve's last day. We are grateful for his service and wish him the best. Wolf, I'm told by a separate White House official just in the last several minutes that Steve Bannon was given was essentially supposed to be fired 2 weeks ago, but was given the option to resign. Obviously, you're getting into some semantics here as to what's, resigning, what's being forced out, what's being fired. Make no mistake, Steve Bannon was fired by the White House. He was fired. He was given the boot. When you were told that you have the option to resign, you are being fired. So just to sort of break our way through the semantics game here, that is essentially what has taken place. And this is essentially something that's been in the works for some time. As I said, a White House official told me that some of this was supposed to happen 2 weeks ago. And so this has obviously been on not just the president's mind, but on John Kelly's mind as soon as he came on board as White House Chief of Staff. From talking to our sources, Wolf, he just simply was not comfortable with Steve Bannon staying around, mainly because, and as we were saying earlier, this has really been a problem that people have had inside this White House with Steve Bannon for some time, that he just simply pursued his own agenda in addition to pushing for the president's agenda. And in the John Kelly power structure, that is just simply not going to work. And from what we're also hearing, there were also some problems inside the White House this last week over these interviews that Steve Bannon was giving to various outlets, where he was essentially trying to speak on behalf of the White House. And that is just not going to work in this John Kelly power structure that's been put in place over there. So just to recap, Wolf, from what we're hearing from White House sources, just to break through some of the White House bureaucratic semantics here, Steve Bannon was fired.
And read that statement from Sarah Huckabee Sanders, Jim, one more time.
Right. The statement is pretty direct. It's pretty to the point here. It says White House Chief of Staff John Kelly and Steve Bannon have mutually agreed today would be Steve's last day. We are grateful for his service and wish him the best. So it sounds as if this really came to a head today, although I got to tell you, Wolf, there are some conflicting stories out there, not being reported by CNN, but by others, that Steve Bannon resigned. All indications are, to us, Wolf, is that he was forced out, he was forced to resign, he was essentially fired.
Yeah, very interesting. David Chalian, I've seen, and John King and I, over the years, a lot of statements from White House officials about somebody leaving the White House. But the notion that the Chief of Staff, John Kelly, and Steve Bannon have mutually agreed today would be Steve's last day. John, you just correct me if I'm wrong. I don't remember a statement from a White House about someone leaving like that.
Let me ask you this. If the Chief of Staff, who's your boss at the White House next to the President, says, I think today should be your last day, you either mutually agree or you get fired.
That's right. That's right.
You don't work the next day.
Don't come back.
Yeah, we're taking away your computer. You just lost your parking spot. We're taking away your passes. He's a human being. We're making, but supposed to Bannon insist he resigned. We're having this conversation about the monuments. We were talking earlier about how this has been a week where it started with Bannon on the outs. Bannon seemed to have the president's ear about where we were going. What does it mean if Steve Bannon, chief White House strategist, a couple of weeks after Reince Priebus, White House Chief of Staff, is shown the door? And Bannon has to, I think, added importance because of his connection to the Trump base.
Steve Bannon has been the ideological center of this White House, for better or worse. He's one of the few people in there who has a set of core beliefs that he very rarely strays from, no matter their political popularity. And he's been the person, when the president has been swayed or attempted to be swayed by others in the Republican Party, others in the White House, Bannon is always there to remind him that these are the issues that you ran on, these are the issues that your supporters care about, these are the issues that you need to be carrying out as president. Him leaving removes that ideological center from the White House. But frankly, Bannon has not been a particularly productive player in this administration, and there has been a lot of concern from other people that while he says he's there for the president's best interest, while he says he's there to promote that agenda, that he's really there to promote himself.
This is interesting, though, now, because Bannon does have a following from a lot of the Republican base that helped get Trump elected,
Yes.
though. And now he is a free agent, potentially, and what does he decide to do with that power? And is there a revolt from that part of the base against the Trump administration, which we've seen when it's been a question of, Bannon versus H.R. McMaster and other people like that? Does this, now that Bannon's on the outs, do they care if he resigned or was pushed out or whatever the formal story?
To that point, his former organization, Breitbart News, which he ran, was talking about the speculation about this earlier in the week, where they said essentially the Dems inside the White House, which is the label they put on Jared Kushner and Gary Cohn, were going to push him out, and it was a, quote, middle finger to Trump voters. Now, the president has a personal connection and relationship with his base, but there is no question that Bannon was his, if not someone who pushed him to this, his soulmate on the issues of America First, on the issues of nationalism, on the issues of trade policy. Trump is Trump. Trump has a connection with his voters. But if the Breitbarts are now in Trump's face all the time, what does that do?
Well, that's the question. Does the populist media coverage now become harsher on Trump that a lot of the Trump voters consume? I think that's important to watch. I do think that the Jeff Sessions departure would have been more consequential with the base, though. I think he's a bigger figure than somebody who was a staffer at the White House in terms of the connection with Trump himself. But what's important is what the future holds. There are basically two parties here who are not going anywhere in the White House. There's the Trump family, and there's the Vice President of the United States, right? Who is ultimately going to win Trump's ear in terms of how he governs and how he even acts as president? Is it going to be the instinctual, centrist, even Democrats who are in his family, and also who are some of his top advisors, or is it going to be the more conservative aligned people who are close to Mike Pence and Mike Pence himself?
I want to welcome our international audience that's joining us. We're now being broadcast around the world as well. The breaking news is the New York Times reporting the president has told his aides that Steve Bannon, the chief White House strategist, a key figure in the Trump general election campaign, Bannon going. You see the tweet there from Maggie Haberman, the New York Times White House correspondent. Administration officials say it was Trump. People close to Bannon insist he resigned. So we will have a debate apparently about how this happened. That happens often in these cases. But let's talk about the significance. Let's start with this. There's a lot to unwrap here, beginning with Bannon's role, what he means, as we were just discussing, what backlash we might get from the Bannon part of the Republican Party, the conservative Trump base. But let's start with first the President of the United States and what this tells us about him, his mindset, about where he thinks his White House is. And we do know the new Chief of Staff, John Kelly, is among those, to Jonathan's point he made earlier, who decided he thought Bannon, for all his saying, I'm here for the president, was sort of trying to advance an agenda of his own. What does it tell us?
Well, that tends to be the tipping point with Trump. If he feels like there is someone there who is pushing their own agenda, who is trying to promote themselves over him, that is when turns on them. And he has increasingly come to believe that about Steve Bannon. There have been different moments in the young presidency where that has happened, when Bannon has been on the cover of Time magazine, when he very clearly participated in a new book that focuses on his role. Even when Saturday Night Live started talking about President Bannon, those things, Trump really internalizes them. But there has just been a real sense that this, even though Trump won't say this publicly ever, there has been a sense in the West Wing and in the Oval Office that this has not been going well. And the fact that Reince is gone, that the Scaramucci hire was so short-lived, and that Bannon is out, I think three comms directors is a reflection that he is searching for the right combination of people in this White House to get this on track. Trump wants to be successful.
I was saying, in a week like this, where we talked about the Confederate monuments and so on, the fact that the person who said, I'm the, my website, where the alt-right started. The fact that he, the fact that he was in the White House, so such a big sign to a lot of people about what Donald Trump would be like. And even if Donald Trump is going to continue to be a nationalist and so on, the fact that Steve Bannon, who a lot of people viewed as